Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you all. My name is Jo Tyndall. I'm Director at the OECD Environment Directorate, and I'm really pleased to welcome you to today's OECD Green Talk Live, focusing on investing in nature, making incentives work for biodiversity. Now, it's probably no surprise to those of you who've joined us for this webinar. We're living through an unprecedented biodiversity crisis. Since 1970, global wildlife populations have declined by nearly 3/4. We're losing species 35 times faster than the natural background rate. And when we degrade our forests, grasslands, and wetlands, we erode the essential services upon which we depend. And there's things like pollination, water purification, and climate regulation, just to give you a few examples. And it's not just a case of biodiversity loss. It doesn't only make our world less vibrant, it also poses a real systemic risk to our economies and to our societies. Now, it's encouraging that governments around the globe have started to recognise the urgency. The Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework that was adopted in 2022 sets a clear goal to halt and reverse biodiversity loss by 2030. Now, there's only 5 years left to achieve this mission, so that means that bold and swift action is clearly needed. And one of the key levers we have is economic incentives for the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. Scaling up these incentives is not only good practice, it is, of course, enshrined in Target 18 of the Kunming-Montreal framework. Those of you familiar with the OECD's work may know that we track economic incentives for biodiversity through our so-called Policy Instrument for the Environment database, or PINE. And this database houses information from over 140 countries. And it's open to all governments to contribute data. But we don't stop at tracking. Our work also examines how we can make better use of these instruments to deliver positive outcomes for biodiversity. And that's the focus of the report the OECD is launching today, scaling up biodiversity-positive incentives, delivering on Target 18 of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. Now, this report, which has been funded by the European Commission, draws together insights from across the globe, from the cloud forests of Colombia to the savannas of South Africa, to show how we can increase both the scale and effectiveness of biodiversity-positive incentives. I'm joined today by Edward Perry. He's a biodiversity policy analyst in the OECD Environment Directorate, and he's going to present the report's key findings. Following his intervention, we're going to hear reactions and insights from 3 discussants. And I'm delighted to welcome Hans Stielstra. He's Advisor, International Environmental Negotiations, DG Environment at the European Commission. Then Julien Ardelin, Head of the Biodiversity and Resources Office, Commissariat Général au Développement Durable in France. And thirdly, Ms. Maria Carolina Pinilla, who's the GEF8 Umbrella Program Coordinator, UNDP, in Colombia. So after their interventions, we're going to open the floor for questions. For those who are joining online, you can send in your questions at any time in the event using the Q&A function in Zoom. And we will try to address as many of them as possible within the time available. And with that, I'm going to pass the floor to Edward, who's going to present an overview of the report. Edward, over to you.
Thank you very much, Jo, and good afternoon or good morning or good evening to you all. see, this is working. Fantastic. It's my pleasure to present some insights to you today from our new report on scaling up biodiversity positive incentives. And I'm presenting also on behalf of my co-authors, Juro Matsone and Katia Karasakis. Any tricky questions, I will redirect to them later. And the focus of this report, as you can see in the title, is scaling up biodiversity positive incentives, and the aim is to help governments deliver on Target 18. We focus on 7 of these incentives: biodiversity positive subsidies, payments for ecosystem services, taxes and fees, for example, for natural resource use or pollution, tradable permits, biodiversity offsets, and the rapidly evolving space of biodiversity credits. And our insights draw from examples from across the globe and across terrestrial, marine, and freshwater ecosystems, as well as multiple sectors. We look at what's working, what's not, and what can be done to scale up these incentives effectively. So why biodiversity positive incentives? Simply put, these instruments help to bring in environmental costs and benefits into everyday economic decisions. Taxes make harmful activities more costly, and payments for ecosystem services reward land users for changing or compensate for changing their practices to deliver off-site ecosystem service benefits for others. And scaling up biodiversity positive incentives is not just about delivering on Target 18. These incentives can also deliver on many other targets of the framework. Let me give you a few examples. So starting with Target 3, in South Africa, we see 2 new tax innovations, essentially subsidies, that are driving the expansion of protected areas and other effective area-based conservation measures in line with the 30 by 30 target. In Denmark, taxation is part of the country's strategy to manage pollution of pesticides and the risks that poses. And then in New Zealand, looking at Target 10 now, tradable fishing permits are helping sustain fish stocks. By essentially putting a price on biodiversity, biodiversity positive incentives can also help to align fiscal and financial flows and mobilize financial resources. And I'm sure we are going to hear much more about that from our panelists shortly. So incentives are not new, and nor are the commitments to scale them up. So actually, Target 3, adopted in 2010 by governments, was similar to that which we've seen in Target 18. Yet, growth in terms of the number of incentives globally and the number of countries with such incentives is slowing. Nevertheless, OECD's report finds significant potential to scale up these incentives. Let's take agricultural payments, for example. Each year, governments provide about 295 billion in budgetary support to farmers. And just 0.6% of that targets environmental objectives. Turning now to biodiversity offsets, we see that globally, the biggest driver of biodiversity offsets are regulatory requirements. Yet just 20% of countries have such requirements. And these are typically narrow in scope in terms of the sectors they cover, the impacts they cover, and so forth. We also see potential to increase their effectiveness. Only half of payment for ecosystem service schemes globally implement best practice design, while a study found that of a sample of biodiversity offset projects, less than 40% achieved no net loss across all their outcome variables. And effectiveness breeds scale. If we can demonstrate effectiveness, we can build the necessary credibility and trust to bring these instruments to scale. So the big question is, how can we unlock this potential? How can we scale up biodiversity positive incentives, and how can we make them more effective? And that's exactly where the report from OECD comes in. We look at each of those instruments in turn and provide case studies and in-depth insights, particularly highlighting good practices globally. And I'd encourage you to look at the report to dive into those insights and good practices. We also provide 10 overarching cross-cutting recommendations for policymakers and practitioners. Now, these are recommendations that apply to all or almost all of the incentives that we cover in the report. For the sake of time, I'll just highlight 3 of these. The first is addressing uncertainties and managing incentives adaptively. Nature is dynamic, markets are dynamic, and our knowledge is incomplete. Policies and projects that fail to recognize that risk failure. Fortunately, we're seeing some good practices. For example, in tradable permits, we see the application of the precautionary principle. This is, for example, setting the cap below scientific thresholds to ensure that that ecosystems and fish stocks are safeguarded. And this is applied in New Zealand's fisheries. In biodiversity offsets, we see the use of multipliers or high offset ratios, sometimes as much as 30-to-1, that help to account for these uncertainties, and also the risk of environmental leakage and things like temporal loss of biodiversity. Adaptive management is equally important. In the US, for example, the initial policy for mitigating impacts on wetlands inadvertently promoted the use of developer-led biodiversity offsets, and these achieved lower biodiversity outcomes. So following an evaluation, the law was reformed in 2008, the policy was reformed, and standards were applied consistently across the 3 different offset policy mechanisms. This led to an improvement in environmental outcomes and also the growth in the wetland mitigation banking market, which now is a market of several billions annually and brings in investment from angel investors through to institutional investors. Looking elsewhere, Denmark and Mexico, for example, regularly review and update their pesticide taxes, seeking effectiveness and efficiency. In Botswana, the protected area fees remained unchanged for 2 decades. And just recently, the government revised those fees and tripled revenues in its first year. So policies need to provide certainty, but they also need to be flexible. They need to be able to adapt following a process of monitoring, of feedback, of adjustment. The second recommendation is on enhancing transparency and verification. Open information, open data on payments, on biodiversity offsets, credits, and tradable permits help to reduce information gaps, to build trust and to hold actors to account. And we're seeing some good practices here too. For example, the adoption of digital public registries. And this is something we've seen in Peru for the MERESE, the Payment for Ecosystem Service Scheme, for example. Solidity trading in New South Wales, Australia. and for biodiversity offsetting here in France, and that's what you see on your screen. So that's transparency, and we really see that whilst there is this progress in certain countries, overall global transparency is patchy, and it will need to improve significantly as nature markets develop. And transparency goes hand in hand with verification. Independent audits, for example, are important for ensuring that projects and policies are in fact delivering on their objectives or their stated outcomes. And that's also important for managing greenwashing. We also see the potential for technological advances to facilitate transparency and verification. For example, we see the use of blockchain has been explored in Colombia for biodiversity credits and in Australia for water markets. So together, transparency and verification fundamental for providing trust, accountability, and ultimately improved environmental outcomes. Third and final recommendation I wanted to highlight today is using public resources strategically. The fundamental importance highlighted by Jo of biodiversity, its public good characteristics, that demands increased public financing. And it doesn't necessarily need to come with increased pressure on budgets. There's a significant opportunity, for example, to redirect inefficient and harmful subsidies towards biodiversity. And this, of course, at the same time reduces harm done to biodiversity and therefore long-term financing needs. Another option is to increase environmental taxes, biodiversity-positive taxes, for example. Carbon pricing instruments, for example, bring in about 100 billion a year in revenue, and biodiversity-positive taxes 10 billion per year, just in OECD countries alone. And both have scope for expansion. We see a number of countries are already earmarking these revenues in pursuit of environmental objectives. And I think a famous example of this is the Costa Rica National Payment for Ecosystem Service Scheme. And so this has been successful in reversing deforestation. However, it is both an example of the success and a clear warning. For Costa Rica has made significant progress in transitioning away from fossil fuels, and that is, of course, reducing the revenues from fossil fuel taxes. And so the country is now looking to diversify funding sources for its payment for ecosystem service scheme. It's not just about spending more, it's about spending smarter. There are some good practices to do this, such as spatially targeting payments towards areas where biodiversity values are high and the threat to that biodiversity is also high. Differentiating payments based on compliance costs is another approach. There's also an argument to shift towards results-based payments or hybrid payments as opposed to practice-based payments. And this has become commonplace in Ireland's agri-environmental payment schemes. And we have a case study in our report. And this is another way of getting greater bang for buck. And then finally, leveraging private finance. So tax incentives, grants, guarantees can help reduce the risk to projects at the early stages and help prepare projects for the market. And we're seeing this is taking place, for example, in the context of the new net biodiversity gain project in the UK, policy in the UK. And so it really has probably its place in nascent markets and covering those early risks. Caveat here, though, is it's important that we evaluate these subsidies carefully and make sure they do remain well targeted so that it remains efficient use of public resources and doesn't displace private finance. So those were just 3 recommendations. So design for uncertainty and manage adaptively, enhance transparency and verification, and use public resources strategically. Just 3 of the 10 recommendations, but it gives you a flavour of the types of actions governments can take to scale up biodiversity positive incentives effectively. Now, let me just leave you with 3 rather high-level takeaways for biodiversity positive incentives. And the first is to say these tools are fundamental for halting and reversing biodiversity loss. They help address market failure, help to align economic activities and finance with biodiversity objectives. As I mentioned, the report shows that there is significant potential to scale up these incentives and to increase their effectiveness. And finally, the good news is that we are not starting from scratch, not by a long shot. We have a wealth of experience across the globe, both successes to build on and setbacks from which we can learn. So what we really need to do is capitalize on this collective experience and ensure we are applying global best practices. And so we hope that this OECD report, by bringing together these insights from across the globe, provides a useful resource for governments and partners to scale up biodiversity positive incentives effectively and rapidly, and ensure lasting benefits for both nature and people. Thank you very much for listening in. I encourage you to take a look at the reports and enjoy reading them. If you are short on time, we do have a policy highlights as well. You will see the front cover there. Thank you, and over to you, Jo.
Well, thank you very much, Edward. And I'm sure that anyone who's ever had a dog knows how effective the incentive of treat training is in order to have a well-behaved pet. So I think that was a really interesting report, and thank you for going through those 7 types of incentives. I was really struck by the graph that showed that growth had been good for a number of years, but is slowing recently. So there's a lot of room to increase effectiveness, as you said. And I'm sure it's a positive message about using public resources strategically and efficiently, rather than necessarily feeling you just have to add more. It's, as you said, Edward, about spending faster. Well, hopefully that's really sparked a lot of reaction, thought. We're looking forward to seeing the questions that might come through. But in the meantime, I really want to start this panel discussion and have 3 people respond directly to the findings of the report and the situations as they apply to them. So I've got a first round of questions. I'm going to ask each of our panelists to speak for 3 minutes so we can get back for a second round and still have time for questions. I'd like to begin with a regional perspective from the European Commission. So I'm going to turn to Hans Stielstra, and ask, what role do you see for biodiversity positive incentives in delivering on the EU biodiversity strategy for 2030 and the nature restoration law? If you can, it would be great to have a concrete example of where you see these incentives already working, or indeed where some of the biggest gaps might remain. So Hans, over to you.
Thank you very much, Jo, for the question, and thank you for inviting me to be part of the panel. And really, congratulations on the report, which sounds extremely interesting. And I'm happy that the OECD is always out there for high quality information in this area. So yeah, on the biodiversity strategy, let me say first of all that we are actually already delivering on the EU biodiversity strategy. There was a report from the JRC the Joint Research Center of the European Commission published earlier this year that showed that most of the measures that we need are already in place. And perhaps the most important of those measures is the nature restoration regulation that entered into force about a year ago. But in a way, that is the good news. The bad news is that progress on the ground is actually relatively limited. The same report that I just mentioned shows that some of the targets we are doing kind of okay. So protected areas, organic farming, remediation of contaminated soil, there we are doing okay, going in the right direction, but too slow. On several others, we are not doing well. That is the honest truth. Nutrient losses, pollinators, for instance. And on many, we don't actually know where we stand. So we don't have the data to say where we are heading. So the message is really now is time for implementation. And for that, the biodiversity positive incentives that are part of your report are really indispensable. Because this regulation, this nature restoration regulation sets the targets, but then we need to somehow construct the incentives to make the farmers, the foresters, the businesses, the investors take action on the ground. And we've asked our member states to produce nature restoration plans, which they will give us by around this time next year. And those will then show us what incentives they have put in place to make those changes on the ground. And we keep on saying that restoration, what we ask them to do is not just there for compliance, it's really also to create economic opportunities. And then we don't even mention yet the ecological advantage of it, but definitely also emphasize the economic opportunity. So these incentives, the biodiversity positive incentives, I think play a couple of roles. One is that they would help us to redirect financial flows. So to start rewarding the practices that actually regenerate ecosystems rather than deplete them. They place, of course, a value on ecosystems, and they also de-risk innovation. So they have these three important roles. And asked for one concrete example at European level, I think the one of the best known ones is the eco schemes that we have as part of the common agricultural policy. Although there's also others that I think would be mentioned, greening public procurement being one that I think is still underexploited. Yeah, and then looking into the future, I think an area that is important to be mentioned is the nature credits. So we have recently published a roadmap towards the development of nature credits at European level. And so really like carbon credits, they would aim to channel private investment to protection projects or nature restoration projects. But on that one, and in general, I think the challenges are really still significant in the sense that we have seen with carbon credits that it takes many years to have a system that is up and running and is not greenwashing and is really a credible instrument for pushing investment in the right direction. So we should not have the illusion that in 1 to 3 years we can have the same thing at European level for biodiversity. But we're taking the first steps in that direction to try and slowly develop that instrument as well. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much for that, Hans, and thank you for your honest assessment of the progress that's been made to date, but the areas that are not going so well. I think that was a really important message, that targets needed to be underpinned by well-designed incentives and clear implementation plans, and very interesting to hear about the potential future of nature credits. Hopefully there are some lessons learned from the difficulties of the carbon credit market that can be applied across. Now, I'm going to stay in Europe, but we're now moving to a country level. Julia, I wonder, could you share an example of a biodiversity positive incentive scheme that's worked particularly well in France? Whether there were some key challenges you've had to overcome, and what were some of the factors that you could identify that made it that make it effective? Yeah, thanks.
Yes, thank you very much for your invitation and the opportunity to share the French policy experience, and congratulations for the report too. So I would like to highlight the example of the French payments for environmental services, the PES. Indeed, an experimental PES schemes for farmers was introduced in 2020 with the objective to incite farmers to adopt environmentally friendly practices. So how does the scheme work in practice? You have several actors. The state, and more precisely the Ministry of Ecology, establishes a national framework for the scheme. It implements management monitoring tools. And then building on this national framework, the process is based on a territorial project approach. You have the French Water Agency that launch calls for expression of interest, to which project sponsors respond by proposing a project. And then after project, an indicator system, very important, the indicator system approval by the agency, the territorial initiatives can start. Project sponsors are mainly intermunicipal water associations, regional natural parks, mainly. What is interesting too is that each project must identify its primary environmental priorities. You have water, biodiversity, climate, or it can be a combination. So you have a bundle of issues, which is, if there is the Nexus report of the IPBS released recently, so it shows the interactions between these issues. In practice, in the first phase between 2020 and 2024, most projects focus on water quality issues. How does it work for farmers? Farmers who engage in the scheme voluntarily commit for 5 to 7 years. The payments promote both changes in farm management, but also the maintenance of good practices of existing features. And the farmers receive payments on annual basis, but you have a cap. It's capped by upper limit values. What key figures on this first phase, because it's an experimental scheme. An overall budget of 170 million euros, approximately more than 3,000 farms involved, representing 300,000 hectares, which is, of course, it's not so much, it's 1% of the utilized agricultural area. But if you look at the areas covered by a PS project, we can see that 1 out of 5 farmers has joined the scheme. So it's quite a good participation rate. What worked well? So we had an assessment conducted in 2023. It demonstrated the scheme's relevance to project leaders and water agencies, but also the success in terms of farmers' participation. Clearly, farmers see it as a way to participate in the development of a flexible scheme designed for them. So that's a key point in terms of the success of the scheme. There were also challenges. If I select one of these challenges, local coordination was crucial to project success. And we realized that the administrative and implementation workload was initially a bit underestimated. So in order to make progress, taking into account this lesson from phase 1, the second phase of the PES scheme, running from 25 to 27, requires closer coordination with farmers. Territorial coordination must be included in the project costs. We now allow local authorities alongside water agencies to select and finance PES initiatives, and also there is a work to have a better, it reminds me the OECD report, better targeting of the indicators. And another important aspect is that this experimental scheme is assessed. We will have another round of evaluation. It's the second phase where we will be able to assess the impacts on the environment of these schemes. So this is what I wanted to share with you on the French experience.
Well, thanks very much, Julien. Very interesting to hear that water has been identified often as a first priority. But equally, from the OECD perspective, we are looking increasingly at the interconnections between different aspects of the environmental challenges, water, biodiversity, climate. So that combination and looking at the interactions, I think it'll be very interesting how that develops. I'm also pleased to hear that you've got a planned evaluation to check and see what needs to be, what's going well and what might need to be adjusted. Okay, let us move from Europe to Latin America. Maria Carolina, it's really great to have you with us. Colombia is, of course, one of the most biodiverse countries in the world. And we know it's been active in exploring different kinds of incentives. So we'd be keen to hear from you how the country, how Colombia is leveraging biodiversity positive incentives to deliver on its biodiversity targets. And also, if you've got an example of a scheme that's working particularly well, please share that.
Thank you, Jo. On behalf of the Deputy Minister of Environmental Politics and Regulation, Mauricio Cabrera, thank you very much for the invitation to this important space about incentives and biodiversity. It's a pleasure to share with you all the Colombia's experiences in advancing biodiversity positive incentives. So since 20 years ago, Colombia is leveraging a wide range of incentives mechanisms that align biodiversity conservation with social and economic benefits. I am talking about the most relevant and recent experiences. The first one is the long-time public financing through the Fund for Life and Biodiversity that prioritizes ecosystem restoration, deforestation containment, land use planning, environmental justice, and payment for environmental services with the Conservar Paga strategy. This program, this fund, expect to mobilize more than $1 million by 2026 with the contributions from the 80% of carbon tax and also the national budget, international cooperation, and donations, private donations. The National Program of Payment for Environmental Services set a national goal to conserve 1 million hectares under local arrangement by 2030. The second one mechanism is the pay for results through the READ Early Movers under Visión Amazonía program, which is led by the Colombian government with the support of Norway, Germany, and the United Kingdom. This program promotes, empowers local population and articulates economic and social sectors to improve the quality of life in Amazon region. The governments move around $125 million between 2016 and 2022 to promote stronger enforcement and conservation incentives that help to reduce deforestation through the enforcement against illegal activities, interministerial co-coordination, and local conservation agreements, including payments for ecosystem services. And also collective land titles and zero deforestation agreements between territorial entities and associations of peasants and indigenous communities. The second phase of Visión Amazonía program will move around $40 million to keep going with a successful strategy that shows facts and data on reducing deforestation in Colombia. The third mechanism is the sustainable finance for protected areas through the Herencia Colombia, and this initiative will move around 240 million on public and private funding to protect permanently 29 million hectares of landscapes and seascapes in protected areas. These mechanisms facilitates a significant progress toward Colombia's 30 by 30 goal, the NDC, and the Sustainable Development Goals through enhancing institutional capacities and supporting local communities. And the four mechanisms is the private finance. In Colombia, the economic instruments have expanded biodiversity offsets, positive incentives for environmental related investment, and newer instruments such as voluntary biodiversity credits. There are two main schemes. The first one is the mandatory regulation scheme, and in this with this approach, the government updated regulations on mandatory biodiversity offsets and compensatory mitigation in 2016, and recognized and regulate the habitat banks in 2017. The voluntary scheme is based on biodiversity credits and habitat banks, has an extension of mandatory biodiversity offset programs, and this creating opportunities to mobilize additional private fundings to purchase credits for both compliance and voluntary purpose. Colombia's financing sector has started to engage in biodiversity finance through the green bonds and corporate sustainable commitments, and also the green taxonomy was launched in 2022 and include targets on biodiversity conservation, climate change, water management, and other environmental objectives. Several banks offer green credit lines for sustainable agriculture and restoration and reforestation project, and this market shows a positive track because 8 years ago the bank has submitted $1.5 million on green bonus, and of course these four initiatives will contribute to progress toward Colombia's national goals on biodiversity, and of course contribute to Kunming-Montreal framework. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria Carolina. And I think, one thing I took from that was very much that you are pulling in a combination of sources, public, carbon tax, private, etc., in order to maximize the results you can get from it. So really interesting to hear. Now, we've got 15 minutes left, so I'm going to ask for short answers to my second round of questions. So we've got a little bit of time to hear any questions from the audience. So Hans, can I come back to you? Edward touched on part of the OECD report that talks about more strategic use of public resources, including redirecting inefficient or environmentally harmful government support. So what do you see as the challenges as well as the opportunities for doing this, for redirecting harmful subsidies towards positive biodiversity outcomes?
Thanks, Jo. Yeah, I'll try to be as short as I can. First of all, really agree with that recommendation from the report. I think the biggest challenge we all have in the context of biodiversity finance is to reform environmentally harmful substances. So that's clearly the biggest challenge of all. And we have taken that commitment at the EU level in the context of our Environment Action Program and also as part of the Global Biodiversity Framework. But we first need to know where we stand. So we have developed a methodology, a guidance to member states to be able to define and subsequently report to us the extent, the presence of environmentally harmful substances. And So that we have put out, and in the course of this year, we will normally have a good overview. You asked about challenges, and I think that is very easy then to bridge to the first important challenge that I wanted to mention, which is data. So simply having, I mean, it's very nice to ask for data, but are we going to get those data? And are the data are going to be meaningful and relevant for policy decisions? So good, strong data relevant for policy is an absolute prerequisite for action in this area. And the second big challenge that I think we all face is the whole, let's call it political economy of environmental harmful substances. The fact that many substances of ours, of course, have created strong linkages with particular constituency, whether these are farmers or fishers or the energy sector even. I mean, in the European context, of course, we have after the energy crisis of 2022, after the prices of energy went up after the invasion of Russia in Ukraine, we have massively started to redirect towards renewable sources. Well, that has been very good for the biomass sector, but that also means that that we now have another community that is perhaps dependent on or more dependent than it should be on particular subsidies. So these constituencies that we have created are, I think, a challenge. One opportunity, however, I think that we have is that there is a huge momentum globally to address this issue. From all the agreements that we have to address those environmentally harmful substances, but also from the fiscal constraints that we have, strangely. I think that forces governments to look more closely at those subsidies and actually provides an opportunity for reform of those subsidies and turning them into, in any case, more beneficial outcomes from the perspective of biodiversity. So I'll keep it to this.
Thanks very much. And I know it is a difficult area. As you say, there are sometimes communities that become highly dependent on subsidies or support, government support, and it is extremely difficult to be able to reform that and work. But in the meantime, you have some very mixed and inconsistent policy signals potentially going out. Can I move now to Maria and Carolina? In the presentation, we heard about links between positive incentives and resource mobilisation. Now, I think you've already touched on this in the answer to the first question, but wanted to ask where you see the most potential for scaling up in using biodiversity-positive incentives to mobilise finance for biodiversity in Colombia.
Yes, thank you for the question. I am going to talk about the strategy with agriculture sector, aware of the strategy role of financing biodiversity positive incentives. The National Financial Fund for Agriculture Sector, FINAGRO, and Biodiversity Finance Initiative from UNDP, BioFin, have designed a roadmap to greening agricultural credits. Biodiversity is the core of the roadmap because the goal is for access to credit not only boost productive, but also strengthen ecosystem conservation and restoration. This objective represents the materialization of the assessment, the big assessment of agriculture sector incentives with negative impacts on biodiversity in Colombia conducted by BioFin, and it supports the national government in designing financial solutions aimed at mobilizing and redirecting and optimizing public and private resources for biodiversity conservation, analyzing and reforming harmful financial incentives with the aim of aligning rural development and financial policies with the international commitments undertaken by the country. The initiative introduced the first incentive reforms roadmap for Colombia, which Finagro and Biofin are implementing to align agriculture credits with sustainable production models using a methodology that combines the ecosystem approach with technical, financial, and social criteria. The process has brought together experts from the financial, agriculture, and environmental sectors to initiality work on 6 productive value chains, such as cattle ranching, rice, cocoa, coffee, cassava, and non-timber forest products that were selected for their territorial importances, level of organization, and credit demands. Right now, we are trying to move another roadmap with other sectors, but we are identifying big challenges in the country. For example, the lack of information and the appropriation of the other sectors of with the harmful incentives. So it's important for us to learn about other developed countries that they are advanced in this topic, and we need to understand better how this process works inside other sectors, and it's important for us exchange lessons, of course, financial approaches and other help that we need to receive from other countries to improve the Colombia's contribution to Target 18. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I think it's great to hear that the financial, agriculture, and environmental sectors are all working together. And as you say, it's really important also to have peer exchange to learn from what each other has done. Okay, final question is for Julia. As countries update their NBSAPs and their national targets to align with the Kunming-Montreal framework, how does France plan to scale up positive incentives in order to be able to deliver on Target 18?
Thank you. So the French NBSAP was adopted in 2023. So it includes 40 measures. And among these 40 measures, I would like to highlight 2 that specifically address the incentives for biodiversity. Measure 37 is about mobilizing public funding in support of biodiversity, but also reducing public expenditures that are harmful to biodiversity. And measure 39 is about mobilizing private funding in support of biodiversity. As you said earlier, when it comes to incentives for biodiversity, eliminating harmful subsidies is just as important as developing positive incentives in order to ensure policy coherence. By the way, a principle which is strongly advocated by OECD. So, as the EU said, the first step is to identify and characterize these harmful subsidies, which is quite difficult exercise. France has made significant progress in this area through the implementation of the state's green budget, which provides an essential foundation. But however, within the framework of the national biodiversity strategy, the aim is to go further by developing a multi-year action plan prioritized by type of expenditure to move towards the removal or reform of public expenditures that are harmful to biodiversity. In addition to the state, we also have a new tool being developed. It is the green budget for local authorities. So we are developing this new tool. So not only the state, but local authorities as well. So this is for the harmful side of the incentives. For the positive incentives, I would like just briefly present you 2 innovative tools France is currently developing. The first one is the natural sites for compensation, restoration, and renaturation, in French SNCRR. the French biodiversity credit system is based on a historic offsetting scheme, which we mean compulsory compensation of environmental impact, that is enforced by European and French legislation. What's new, this scheme was extended to voluntary offset through the Green Industry Act in October 2023. So France has opted for a multifunctional scheme covering 3 use cases. So not only mandatory offsetting, which is the historical approach, but also voluntary contribution that can come from either industries, the value chains of which are dependent on biodiversity, or demand arising from social and environmental responsibility or philanthropy. So this new tool, the SNCRR, we have 3 sites approved currently and 4 new sites in 2026. 4 commitments for 4 new sites in 2026. The second innovation we have currently is a pilot with under the set of the IAPB pilot. So we are piloting an experimental biodiversity certificate scheme in wetlands. It is supported by the European Commission's Green Assist initiative. We thank very much. The pilot project aims at to test a voluntary certificate system, allowing both public and private funding for wetland conservation. So it would involve all users of these areas, farmers, livestock breeders, foresters, etc. So we are developing this a master plan for this experiment, which is expected to be completed by autumn this year. And in 2026, the experiment will be conducted to put this framework into practice, into real practice.
Okay, thank you very much, Julien, because I think that gives us quite a good opening to, we've got time for one question from the audience, and it kind of follows on from what you were saying. The question is on market innovation, and it says, with biodiversity credits still emerging, how should governments and international bodies balance innovation in nature credit markets with the risks of greenwashing and also loss of public trust? Nobody's identified as a particular target for that, so who would like to give a brief response before we close? Julien? No?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, okay.
I thought you'd taken your mic mute off, but you hadn't.
Yes.
But
yes,
I'm passing to you now.
Yeah, very briefly, just to tell you that France was involved, in the International Advisory Panel on Biodiversity Credits together with the UK. And this is exactly the idea that is you have big risk. There is the idea of having a high integrity systems. And so the IAPB released last year a set of principles, and the idea of these principles is to ensure that we minimize the risk, and at the same time we scale up the level of financing. This is exactly the objective of these principles. But of course, if principles, when they are on the papers, it's not sufficient. This is why it was coupled with the launch of 30, more than 40, I think, today, pilots to test really this principle. Do this principle easy or difficult? What are the challenges? What are the issues? How does it work in practice? So having very strong principle, but at the same time, test them on the field. So this is the first way to answer on this trade-off. This is not a trade-off. Integrity, without integrity, you have got no confidence, no market. But at the same time, you have administrative costs, as we have seen in the PES program. So integrity first, but of course, try to improve the efficiency. So strong principle and test on the field.
Thank you very much. Very strong message, I think, and very rational indeed. Anyone else want to make a very quick comment on that question? And if not, I will move to some closing remarks. I want to very much thank all our speakers and panelists, and of course to all of you who have been joining us for today's discussion. We know that biodiversity loss is not an abstract concern, it's a present challenge, a growing challenge for economies and societies everywhere. But we also know that incentives work better than almost anything to shift behaviour, mobilise resources, and can really help to support a transition towards a nature positive future. Edward, I think it was, at one point made the comment that we're not starting from scratch. There's a wealth of collective experience that shows us how to move faster and smarter. And when ambition is coupled with sound design and strong implementation, we can see, and we've heard today, that biodiversity positive incentives really deliver impact, from curbing deforestation and restoring wetlands to helping fish stocks recover. So getting those economic incentives realigned to deliver the biodiversity results we want, it's central to the transformation we need. And Target 18 of the Global Biodiversity Framework is explicit. Governments must reform incentives that harm biodiversity and scale up those that support it. So I want to stress that the OECD's report, Scaling Up Biodiversity Positive Incentives, really offers concrete ways forward, highlighting good practices, clear recommendations to increase and reach these incentives and make them more effective, credible, and equitable. So the task now is to apply the lessons, work together, and we've heard a lot about that today, across governments, the private sector, communities, and international partners. So on behalf of the OECD, I want to thank you once again for being part of this really important conversation. And I do strongly invite you to explore the report in more detail and take its insights into your work. As we said, as Edward said, if you're time poor, go for the policy highlights and make sure you get those key messages. I also want to finish by taking the opportunity to share the topic of our next Green Talks live webinar. This is going to focus on mortality risk valuation in policy assessment, and it's going to take place on the 1st of October. You can find a link for further information in the chat. And with that, I want to wish you a good rest of the day or night, and I formally close today's event. Thank you.